If you still need the world to love you, this will feel like death. Part 1. You don't discover a man like Fenelon. You get cornered by him. You don't find Francois Fenelon because you're curious. You find him because you're out of exits. People say they read the saints. They say they study the mystics. They say they love theology. That's not how this works. A man like Fenelon shows up when the part of you that wants to be admired is starving, when the part of you that wants to be understood is bleeding, when the part of you that wants to win is exhausted, when the part of you that wants to be safe is finally starting to admit it's never been safe. He doesn't arrive like an influencer, he arrives like a witness. And you don't feel inspired, you feel exposed. Because the first thing he does is take your most sacred modern religion, self-improvement, and quietly murder it without raising his voice. Not with rebellion, not with debate, not with argument. With a sentence so simple your ego can't fight it without showing itself. He doesn't tell you to build a better life. He tells you the life you're building is the trap. And that's what you hate about him. Because you're not ready to admit what you've been calling growth is just sophisticated control. You're not ready to admit what you've been calling discipline is fear wearing a suit. You're not ready to admit what you've been calling purpose is a narcotic, a way to avoid the terror of surrender. So you keep God as a concept. You keep God as an accessory. You keep God as a motivational overlay on top of your real religion. And if we're honest, you don't want a God who is God. You want a God who supports your brand of survival. You want a God who keeps you feeling chosen while you stay in charge. You want a God who helps you win. And then you find Fenelon, and the air in the room changes. Because he doesn't care if you win. He cares if you die. Not die as in drama, not die as in theater. Die as in the self you're calling you finally collapses. Die as in the counterfeit center of gravity in you gets exposed and dissolves. Die as in the thing that keeps asking, am I okay? Am I good? Am I safe? Am I impressive? Am I special? Finally gets answered with silence. And your whole system panics because it has lived on that question for your entire life. Your whole system is built around staying alive. And Fenelon is a man who lived like he already lost everything, which is why he sounds like someone who cannot be threatened. And that's why you feel him in your ribs, because you are threatened, not by his tone, by his reality, by the possibility that the thing you call your life is actually just a long negotiation with fear, by the possibility that your spirituality is just a socially acceptable form of self-protection, by the possibility that your faith is mostly a strategy to avoid the cross. And the cross is always where this goes. Not the cross as jewelry, not the cross as branding, the cross as death, the death of the self that needs to be seen, the death of the self that needs to be right, the death of the self that needs to matter, the death of the self that needs to be spiritual. You say you want truth, but what you actually want is relief. And relief is the drug your ego asks for when it's about to be found out. That's why the moment you come near someone like Fenelon, you start negotiating with length. You start bargaining with intensity. You start trying to use him for content or inspiration or some clean takeaway. Because the deeper thing is terrifying. The deeper thing is this. He might actually be right. He might actually be describing God as he is, not as you need him. And if that's true, then your entire inner architecture is about to be dismantled. So, before we talk about the biography, before we talk about the theology, before we talk about why he was called heretic, just let this land like a blade. You weren't led to him to learn. You were led to him to be undone. And if you still think spiritual life is about becoming better, then you haven't met him yet. Not really, because the first demand he makes without demanding it is this: stop improving the self, start losing it. And you can feel your whole nervous system resist because you've built a world on not losing. So we'll go slow, not to be gentle, to make sure you can't escape. 2. He wasn't born into your fantasy, he was born into the machine. Francois Fenelon didn't grow up in your modern spiritual marketplace. He didn't have your privilege of choosing a path like it's a lifestyle brand. He was born into a world where power was visible, where hierarchy was explicit, where the church wasn't just a personal comfort. It was a structure. It was authority. It was policy. It was control. It was civilization. And that matters because you keep thinking the problem is people. You keep thinking the problem is bad leaders. You keep thinking the problem is corruption. But the problem is deeper than corruption. The problem is the world order, the whole operating system that always takes what is living and turns it into something manageable. It takes what is holy and turns it into something usable. It takes God and turns him into a role inside a human institution. And that's where Fenelon lived, inside the heart of it. He wasn't an outsider yelling at the gates. He was inside the cathedral, inside the hierarchy, inside the court-adjacent world of influence. And the reason that matters is because his life is the perfect mirror for you. You think the system is out there. You think the battle is external, but the system lives in you. It lives in your need for approval. It lives in your reflex to defend yourself. It lives in your addiction to being understood. It lives in your compulsion to position yourself as right, as special, as chosen, as different. It lives in the part of you that can't surrender without being applauded for surrendering. And Fenelon watched that system up close in the world around him, and he watched the same thing inside the human heart. That's why his spirituality is surgical, because he didn't come from naivete. He came from proximity. He saw what power does to the soul. He saw what religion does when it becomes a career. He saw what happens when holiness becomes a performance. And you can't hear him unless you admit something you don't want to admit. A lot of what you call faith is performance. Maybe not for an audience. Maybe just for yourself. Maybe just for that inner judge you've been feeding since childhood. But it's performance. Because the ego does not stop being ego when it walks into church. It just changes costumes. It swaps lust for virtue. It swaps greed for righteousness. It swaps vanity for calling. It swaps domination for leadership. And your ego loves church environments because church gives it a socially acceptable way to feel superior while pretending to be humble. That's why religious systems can become some of the most violent systems on earth without ever spilling blood. Because the violence is internal. The violence is shame. The violence is hierarchy pretending it's holiness. The violence is purity pretending it's love. The violence is control pretending it's guidance. And Fenelon, a man who rose within the church, becomes dangerous not because he rebels politically, but because he refuses to play the inner game. He starts speaking in a language the ego can't monetize. He starts pointing at the one thing the institution can't tolerate, the death of self. Because once the self dies, the institution loses its leverage. Once the self dies, you can't be controlled by reward. Once the self dies, you can't be threatened by punishment. Once the self dies, you stop needing the world to love you, which means the world can't own you. So watch what happens. A man rises inside the machine, but he doesn't belong to it. He carries something older than it. He carries the scent of Christ, not the brand of Christianity. And eventually the machine does what it always does. It marks him. It investigates him. It labels him. It reduces him to a problem. And you're still thinking this is history, but it's not history. It's your life. Because the moment God starts dismantling you, the internal institution in you reacts the same way. It investigates. It accuses. It demands proof. It demands safety. It demands structure. It demands that God be predictable, and God refuses, which is why the part of you that is built on control calls surrender dangerous. Not because it's dangerous, because it's fatal. Fatal to the self you've been protecting like a god. And this is why Fenelon matters. Because his life isn't a lesson, it's a map of what happens when God is actually God, and you let him. 3. The heresy wasn't an idea, it was a posture. When people hear heretic, their modern mind reaches for doctrinal debate. They imagine a man teaching something wrong. They imagine a theological scandal. They imagine an argument with footnotes. That's not what makes a man like Fenelon a threat. The threat is not an idea. The threat is a posture, a way of being, a way of losing. The system can tolerate almost any idea if it can control the person. The system can tolerate debate because debate keeps you in the head. Debate keeps you in performance. Debate keeps you in the illusion that truth is a thing you can own. But a man who has actually died to self stops needing to win. And that is intolerable because institutions are built on people who need to win. Institutions are built on people who need status. Institutions are built on people who need the world to validate their existence. Institutions are built on people who can be steered by fear and reward. So what happens when someone stops responding to those levers? They call it pride. They call it rebellion. They call it deception. They call it heresy. Because the institution cannot admit the truth. This person isn't rebelling. This person is free. And freedom is the one thing the world cannot forgive, because freedom exposes captivity. Fenelon's spirituality cuts straight into the nerve of your modern Christian self-improvement religion. Not because he's trying to offend you, because he sees the lie. He sees how easily you can turn God into a means to peace, a means to success, a means to healing, a means to becoming whole, a means to becoming better, a means to becoming more loving, a means to becoming more spiritual. And your ego loves that language because it keeps you at the center. God becomes fuel. God becomes leverage. God becomes a tool. And you can still call it Christianity. You can still quote verses. You can still cry during worship. You can still say Jesus. But the truth underneath is this: you are still worshiping self, just with religious vocabulary, and Fenelon's whole life becomes one long refusal to let God be used. He insists on something your ego hates: pure love, love without payoff, surrender without reward, obedience without emotional benefit, faithfulness without consolation. You read that and something in you starts bargaining. Your nervous system starts negotiating. Okay, but why would I do that? Do you hear yourself? That question is the entire religion of the world. Why would I do that if it doesn't give me something? Why would I surrender if I don't get relief? Why would I obey if I don't get blessing? Why would I lose myself if I don't get a better self? And Fenelon quietly, relentlessly keeps walking you toward the cliff. Because God is God. Because love is love. Because truth is truth. Not because it works. Not because it benefits you. Not because it improves your life. And this is where the modern spiritual consumer panics, because you've been trained to measure everything by what it gives you. Your entire consciousness is economic. You don't just buy products, you buy identities, you buy meaning, you buy spirituality, you buy the feeling of being safe, and you bring that same consumer mind into religion. So you think God's job is to help you. You think God's job is to support you. You think God's job is to bless your plans. But what if God's job is to end you? What if the real blessing is the destruction of the self that keeps suffering? What if the mercy is the removal of the false center? What if the love is not comfort but crucifixion? You hear crucifixion and your mind immediately tries to moralize it, to turn it into a metaphor, to turn it into a motivational slogan. But no, crucifixion is humiliating. Crucifixion is exposure. Crucifixion is the death of control in public. Crucifixion is the end of your ability to manage your image. And you can't follow Christ without it. You can't. Because the self that runs your life cannot coexist with God. It can learn religious language. It can perform church. It can cry. It can confess. It can volunteer. It can lead. But it cannot surrender. Because surrender is its death. So when Fenelon speaks, he's not arguing doctrine. He's describing the posture of a soul that has already accepted its own annihilation. And that's why he gets labeled. Because institutions don't fear ideas. They fear people who can't be bought. They fear people who don't need to be loved. They fear people who have already lost. And if you still think heresy is mainly about incorrect theology, you're not seeing the real battle. The real battle is always the same. Will you let the false self die? Or will you keep calling it you and defend it with your life? Because the moment you defend it, you've chosen the world. even if you say Jesus. And this tension doesn't resolve, not yet, because the next layer is sharper. Fenelon didn't just write about dying to self, he lived the consequences. Part 4, the court, the church, the polished world, and the quiet knife inside him. It's easy to romanticize a mystic if you forget where he lived. Fenelon wasn't a desert hermit writing from a cave. He moved within sophisticated worlds. He was educated, he was articulate, he was trusted, he rose. And that's exactly why he is such a brutal mirror to you. Because your ego's favorite lie is that surrender is only for people who opt out. Your ego tells you, if I had different circumstances, then I could be holy. If I had less pressure, then I could be free. If I had a simpler life, then I could surrender. If I didn't have to deal with all this complexity, then I could be pure. That's the lie, because the bondage is not in the circumstances, the bondage is in you. So God doesn't need to remove you from the world to kill the self. He can kill the self in the middle of the world. That's what makes it real, and that's what makes it undeniable. Because if you can only surrender when everything is quiet and safe, then you haven't surrendered. You've negotiated. You've created conditions. You've made an agreement with fear. Fenelon is not impressive because he wrote about surrender. He's impressive because he refused to use God as a way to preserve himself. He refused to turn spirituality into an escape from reality. He refused to turn holiness into a performance for influence. He carried the knife of death inside him while living in environments that would feed the ego endlessly. And you know exactly what I mean by that. Because you felt it. You felt how certain environments awaken your hunger. You felt how certain social settings activate your need. You felt how quickly you start scanning for approval without even choosing it. You felt how your identity wants to reform the second you're around people. It starts building a self in real time, a version of you that can survive the room, a version of you that can win the moment, a version of you that can't be rejected. And you call that personality. You call that social skills. You call that being normal. But it's not normal. It's slavery. It's a nervous system trained to perform for safety, and the world rewards it, so you think it's life. But it's not life, and it's adaptation. It's the animal self doing what it must do to avoid death. And Christ calls that self to die, not because he hates you, because he loves you, because he's trying to free you from the constant labor of being you. Fenelon lived in a world where the false self could be endlessly rewarded. He could have made religion into influence. He could have made holiness into power. He could have made God into a career. And maybe parts of him were tempted by that because he was human. But the arc of his life reveals something rare. He kept choosing the inner crucifixion. He kept choosing the unseen. He kept choosing the loss of himself. And then the inevitable happens. Because it always happens. When a person stops serving the systems, internal or external, the system reacts. Not because it's evil in a cartoon way, because it's insecure. Because the system is built on a promise. If you play the game, you can survive. If you perform, you can belong. If you obey, you can be safe. If you improve, you can be loved. And when someone stops playing, it exposes the lie. It reveals that the safety was never real. It reveals that belonging was conditional. It reveals that love was transactional. It reveals that the entire structure is maintained by fear. So the system must discredit the person. It must label them. It must categorize them. It must make them an example. Not always publicly, sometimes quietly, sometimes with investigations, sometimes with whispers, sometimes with condemnation framed as concern. Careful with that teaching. Careful with that emphasis. That sounds dangerous. It could confuse people. Do you hear it? That's the voice of the world. That's the voice that murdered Christ. Not because Christ was violent, because Christ was free, because Christ did not need to be loved by the world, and anyone who doesn't need the world is a threat to it. So Fenelon's life becomes a collision, not just with church politics, with the spiritual economy of the world, the economy that says, earn approval, earn safety, earn worth. And he keeps saying, without saying, worth is not earned, truth is not earned, God is not purchased, love is not bought, the self is the problem. and the only way out is death. And you feel the pressure building, because if that's true, then your entire modern spirituality is exposed as a coping mechanism. And you will do anything to keep your coping mechanisms. You will call them wisdom. You will call them discernment. You will call them growth. You will call them balanced theology. But underneath, it's fear. It's fear of losing the self. And Fenelon keeps walking anyway, straight toward the place where the institution cannot tolerate him, straight toward the word the world uses when it can't control you: heretic. 5. The hidden war, not between good and bad, but between surrender and control. Let's stop pretending this is about religious history. This is about you, because the same conflict that surrounded Fenelon is the conflict inside your chest every day. Not good versus bad, not right versus wrong, not orthodox versus heretical, surrender versus control. That's the whole war. And the reason you can't win this war is because the self cannot surrender itself. The self can promise surrender. The self can plan surrender. The self can perform surrender. The self can talk about surrender. But the self cannot do it, because surrender is the death of the self. So when you read a man like Fenelon, the reason you feel seen isn't because he has clever insights. It's because he names the thing you keep trying to hide with spiritual language. You are still in charge, even when you pray, even when you fast, even when you worship, even when you let go. Because the very way you let go is strategic. It's to get peace. It's to get relief. It's to get a result. And this is where he becomes unbearable to the religious ego, because he exposes the truth. You don't want God. You want the benefits of God. You don't want Christ. You want the feeling Christ gives you. You don't want the cross. You want resurrection without death. You want glory without humiliation. You want eternity without surrender. And the whole world system exists to support that fantasy. Even the religious world system, especially the religious world system, because the institution needs you to stay in control. It needs you to keep trying. It needs you to keep improving. It needs you to keep measuring yourself. It needs you to keep needing the institution. It needs you to keep needing guidance. It needs you to keep needing validation, because the moment you truly die to self, you stop needing what the institution sells. And what does it sell? Not God, certainty, belonging, identity, moral superiority. A framework where you can feel safe. A framework where you can feel chosen. A framework where you can feel right. And the world loves frameworks, because frameworks let you avoid surrender. Frameworks let you avoid naked trust. Frameworks let you avoid the abyss, and the abyss is where God meets you, not because God is cruel, because the abyss is where your false foundations collapse. The abyss is where your idols stop working. The abyss is where your strategies die. The abyss is where the self has nothing left to bargain with, and then, finally, you are available. So the real heresy is not what Fenelon believed. The heresy is that he pointed people into the abyss. He pointed them into the place where the institution cannot follow. Because institutions are built to protect you from the abyss. They are built to manage God. They are built to keep the spiritual life contained. They are built to make holiness predictable. They are built to make salvation manageable. But the cross is not manageable. The cross is not predictable. The cross is not safe. The cross is death. And the moment you accept that, you realize why Christ was murdered: because he refused to be managed. He refused to be used. He refused to be reduced. He refused to play the religious game. He refused to validate the institution's control. He exposed it just by being free. So when Fenelon starts emphasizing a spirituality of surrender, of disinterest in self, of love without reward, the system hears something else. This man is teaching people to stop responding to our levers. This man is teaching people to stop needing us. This man is teaching people to stop building identity here. This man is teaching people to die. And death is always a threat to the world, because the world is built on people who are afraid of death, afraid of losing, afraid of humiliation, afraid of not mattering, afraid of being nothing, So the world offers them endless ways to be something. Success, status, virtue, influence, spirituality, even Christian self-improvement. All of it is the same drug. Don't die. Stay alive. Keep building. Keep proving. Keep becoming. And Fenelon, like a quiet executioner of illusion, keeps saying, stop. Not because life is bad, because the life you're living is not life. It's a performance for love. It's slavery. And you can feel your whole inner system start to get offended. Not because he's wrong, because he's right. Only a slave gets offended at the mention of chains. Only a slave panics when you say, you're not free. Because if you were free, you would just nod. You would just see it. You would just breathe. But the offended self is the self that still needs the world. So if you're offended right now, good. That's not a problem. That's the self showing itself, and that's the animal in you exposing its cage. And we're not resolving this tension yet, because the next layer gets even more personal. Why would God allow a man like this to be condemned? Why would God allow the institution to win? Why would God allow obscurity, unless obscurity is the point? Part 6, the exile. When God lets the world misunderstand you on purpose. If you're still living for vindication, you can't hear this section, because it will sound like cruelty. But if you've been through the pit, you'll recognize it instantly. God does not always rescue his friends from misunderstanding. Sometimes he does the opposite. Sometimes he seals their mouth. Sometimes he lets the system label them. Sometimes he lets them be seen as wrong. Sometimes he lets them be cast out. Not because God is absent, because God is killing something. And what he's killing is the self that still needs to be understood. This is where the mystic path becomes unbearable to the religious performer. Because the performer needs the world to witness their holiness. The performer needs the world to approve their surrender. The performer needs the world to affirm their suffering. The performer needs the world to say, yes, you're right. Yes, you're good. Yes, you're chosen. But the true path, the path Christ walked, includes something the performer cannot accept. Being right and being rejected anyway. Being pure and being misunderstood anyway. Being surrendered and being condemned anyway. This is the cross, not as theology, as reality. And Fenelon's life carries that pattern. He becomes a man under suspicion, a man under scrutiny, a man whose very emphasis, surrender, disinterest, the death of self, becomes framed as dangerous. And you can almost hear the institution's logic. If people stop seeking reward, they'll stop obeying. If people stop fearing punishment, we lose control. If people stop needing our validation, we lose relevance. So the institution does what it always does. It moralizes control. It calls control care. It calls dominance discernment. It calls fear wisdom. It calls conformity unity. It calls surrender extreme. It calls death dangerous. And then it investigates. And then it condemns. And the modern mind thinks, well, that's unfortunate. But the mystic recognizes something deeper. This is the proof. This is the evidence that the man touched something real. Because the world does not persecute what belongs to it. The world does not label what serves it. The world does not condemn what it can use. The world only goes after what threatens its operating system. So if Fenelon was truly harmless, the institution would have embraced him. It would have packaged him. It would have made him a mascot. It would have turned his writing into a safe devotional. It would have used him to keep people comfortable. But his message wasn't comfort. It was death. And death cannot be packaged without becoming a lie. So God lets him be exiled. God lets him be obscured. God lets him be misunderstood. And you need to hear why, because this is where your whole modern spirituality breaks. God is not trying to protect your reputation. God is not trying to protect your identity. God is not trying to protect your comfort. God is trying to free you. And freedom requires the death of the part of you that needs to be seen as free. Do you understand what that means? That it means God will let you look crazy. It means God will let you look wrong. It means God will let people misread you. It means God will let the world keep its story about you. Because the moment you stop defending your story, you start dying. And that's what the world cannot tolerate. A person who won't defend themselves. Not because they're weak, Because they're no longer building a self. They're no longer negotiating with the world for identity. They're no longer using other people's perception as oxygen. They're no longer trying to control the narrative. And that's what Christ did. He didn't come down from the cross. He didn't correct the misunderstanding. He didn't defend himself. He didn't prove them wrong. He died. And that death wasn't just an event. It was a revelation. This world runs on accusation. This world runs on shame. This world runs on control. This world runs on the need to be right. This world runs on narrative dominance. And Christ refused to play. So the world murdered him. And Fenelon, in a quieter historical way, lives the same pattern. The religious system cannot tolerate his posture. So it labels him. And God does not rescue him from that label, because the label is part of the purification. The label is the knife. The label is the fire. It burns the last remaining need for approval. It burns the last remaining desire to be recognized. It burns the last remaining hunger to be celebrated. It forces the soul to choose. Will you be held by God alone, or will you crawl back into the world for love? And this is why his obscurity is not an accident, it's an indictment. Because the world doesn't hide what helps it. The world hides what exposes it. And a spirituality of death exposes the entire world order as a fear-based performance. So it buries it. It makes it obscure and it makes it historical. It makes it irrelevant. It makes it niche. It turns it into something for academics or for rare, desperate people who are at the end of themselves. And that's the point. Because if you still have a life to protect, you won't come here. But if you've lost everything, or if God is removing everything, this is where you end up. Not because you're special, because you're finally out of options. And the next layer is where Fenelon stops being a saint in your mind and becomes a weapon in God's hand, his theology of death, not as philosophy, as doorway. 7. The theology of death, the doorway you keep trying to decorate. You want resurrection, you want the new life, you want peace, you want joy. You want the abundant life. But if you still need the world to love you, you do not want Christ. You want an anesthetic, because Christ does not negotiate with the false self. Christ kills it, not with violence toward others, with violence toward illusion, with a truth so pure it destroys the counterfeit center in you. So when Fenelon speaks about death, he isn't being poetic. He's being literal in the only way that matters. The self you think you are has to go. Not because you're bad, because you're not real. The false self is not you. It's a construction, a survival apparatus, a personality built around fear, a social mask built around safety, a moral identity built around control, a spiritual identity built around feeling chosen. And you will cling to it like it's your life because it is your life in this world, but it's not your life in God. In God, it has to die. And your ego hears that and immediately tries to turn it into something healthy. It tries to sanitize it. It tries to make it therapeutic. It tries to make it manageable. It tries to make it a concept you can apply. But Fenelon isn't giving you a concept. He's describing an execution. And that execution feels like suffering. Not because God is cruel, because the false self experiences its own collapse as torture. The false self is built to avoid exposure. So when it's exposed, it screams. The false self is built to maintain control. So when control is removed, it panics. The false self is built on being seen. So when it becomes unseen, it feels annihilated. The false self is built on narrative. So when the narrative dissolves, it feels like madness. And this is why the path is narrow. Not because God is exclusive, because very few people are willing to be undone. Most people want God as reinforcement. They want a spiritual upgrade. They want divine endorsement. They want a religious cover on top of the same life. And when Christ actually comes near, they back away because they realize he's not here to help the self. He's here to end it. So the world offers them a substitute, a Christian self-help gospel, a prosperity gospel, a personal development Jesus, a best life now Christ, a motivational faith, a religion of winning. And it sells like wildfire because it feeds the ego while calling it God. It tells you you're chosen while keeping you terrified. It tells you you're blessed while keeping you addicted. It tells you you're growing while keeping you enslaved to performance. It tells you you're faithful while keeping you negotiating with God, like he's a vending machine. And Fenelon stands in the middle of that marketplace like a silent indictment, because his life and his writings say one thing: stop negotiating. Stop demanding feelings. Stop demanding proof. Stop demanding reward. Stop demanding safety. Stop demanding success. Stop demanding that God makes sense. Love God because he is God. Surrender because he is God. Obey because he is God. And let the self that wants benefit die. This is where the modern mind short circuits, because it has no category for love without payoff. It has no category for faith without emotional reinforcement. It has no category for obedience without reward. It has no category for surrender without a better life. And that's why the world labels this dangerous, because it is dangerous to the world. Because once a person stops seeking payoff, the world loses its hooks. The world cannot bribe them. The world cannot shame them. The world cannot threaten them. The world cannot flatter them. And when the world can't control you, it calls you a problem. It calls you extreme. It calls you heretic. It calls you arrogant. It calls you deceived. It calls you unstable because it cannot admit the truth. It's afraid. Afraid of a person who has nothing left to protect. Afraid of a person who has already died. So Fenelon's theology of death isn't just mystical teaching. It's spiritual warfare, not warfare against people. Warfare against the operating system of the world, the system that runs on fear, reward, control, performance, identity. And this is where you need to be honest. You have been living in that operating system, even in your religion, even in your spirituality, even in your truth, because you still want the world to validate your truth. You still want the world to recognize your awakening. You still want the world to confirm your freedom, and that means you're still in chains. So let Fenelon do what he does. Let him strip you. Let him remove your religious cosmetics. Let him expose your bargaining. Let him show you the real crucifixion, not suffering you choose to look holy, suffering that comes when God removes the self's ability to feed. And then you will understand why his path is hidden, because you can't sell death. You can't market death. You can't build an institution on death. Because death destroys institutions. Not by attacking them, by making them irrelevant, by producing people who don't need them. And that's why the system buried him. And that's why you're here now. And we're not concluding, because the last layer is the most devastating. If a man like Fenelon lived and was condemned and was hidden, what does that say about the world you still want to belong to? You've been trained to think truth rises naturally. You've been trained to think goodness gets celebrated. You've been trained to think holiness gets recognized. You've been trained to think light shines and people rejoice. That's the fantasy. That's the child's story. That's the story the world tells, so you keep participating. But the real pattern is the opposite. The world buries what exposes it. The world elevates what serves it. The world praises what reinforces it. The world hides what threatens it. Not always with malice, often with instinct, because the world is not a person. It's a spirit, a shared operating system, a collective ego, a fear-based order. And that order cannot tolerate the thing Fenelon represents: a man who stopped needing the world, a man who stopped feeding the self, a man who stopped bargaining, a man who embraced death as the doorway. Because once you see that, your entire relationship to civilization changes. You stop asking the world for meaning. You stop asking the world for identity. You stop asking the world for love. You stop asking the world to be home, because you realize it never was. And this is where Christ's words become unbearable. If the world hates you, not if some people hate you, the world, the order, the system, the way things are, the whole structure that runs on fear and pride and shame and domination. If that world hates you, it hated me first. Not because you're special, because you're not belonging to it anymore. Because your belonging was the hook. Belonging is the leash. Belonging is how the world keeps you manageable. Belonging is how the world keeps you obedient. So when you start to die, you start to become unmanageable. And the world doesn't always come at you with violence. Sometimes it comes at you with obscurity. It just ignores you. It dismisses you. It makes you irrelevant. It makes sure your name doesn't circulate. It makes sure your message stays niche. It makes sure your path looks dangerous. It makes sure you're not mainstream, because mainstream is control. And Fenelon, by being who he was, could never be mainstream. Not in the religious machine, not in the political machine, not in the cultural machine, because he wasn't selling a product. He was pointing toward death, and death is the one thing the world cannot monetize, so it buries it. And here's the part you don't want to admit. You want to be buried and celebrated at the same time. You want to be hidden and known at the same time. You want to be dead and admired at the same time. You want the mystic path, but you still want followers. You want surrender, but you still want recognition. You want Christ, but you still want the world's applause. And that's why you're still suffering. Not because God is absent, because the self is still alive. The self that wants to matter. The self that wants to be seen as profound. The self that wants to be safe. The self that wants to be right. The self that wants to be the one who gets it. And Fenelon's obscurity is not just an indictment of the institution. It's an indictment of you. Because if you truly wanted God, you wouldn't need anyone to know. If you truly wanted truth, you wouldn't need a platform. If you truly wanted Christ, you wouldn't need validation. But you still do. And that's not condemnation. That's diagnosis. That's the chain. That's the hook. That's the place the world still owns you. So the conspiracy isn't just out there. It's in the structure. The structure hides true witnesses because true witnesses produce freedom, and freedom collapses the structure. So the structure elevates substitutes, religious celebrities, spiritual influencers, prosperity prophets, self-help pastors, therapeutic Christianity. All of it is designed to keep the self alive while calling it God. All of it is designed to keep you improving instead of dying. All of it is designed to keep you consuming instead of surrendering. All of it is designed to keep you needing the world while saying you belong to heaven. And then you wonder why you feel empty. You wonder why you feel numb. You wonder why you keep growing and nothing changes. Because you've been polishing chains. You've been calling it freedom. You've been calling it spiritual maturity. You've been calling it blessing. And Fenelon, hidden, condemned, obscure, stands like a quiet mirror and says, stop. Let the self die. Let the world misunderstand you. Let the world ignore you. Let the world hate you. Let it all go. Not because you're trying to be radical, because that's the only way to belong to God. Because as long as you still need the world, you are not free. And this is where the tension does not resolve. Because now you have to decide what you're going to do with this. Not intellectually, existentially. You can admire Fenelon and keep your life, or you can let his life become the knife that God uses to kill yours. Not your body, yourself. The identity you keep defending. The image you keep managing. The story you keep protecting. The world you keep needing. And if you're still trying to keep your control, then you're not ready. But if you're tired, if you're finally tired of building yourself, if you're finally tired of earning love, if you're finally tired of performing your worth, if you're finally tired of negotiating with God, then you already know what this is asking of you. Not a new habit, not a new framework, not a new self-improvement plan. Death. It's time for you to die.